Have you ever willingly done something that you knew would get you in trouble with the police? 3 months ago, I got sentenced to house arrest for a DUI. The judge gave me 6 months with an ankle monitor. I had to stay within a quarter-mile of my house, and when I asked what would happen if I didn't, the judge told me, I don't want to find out. For 3 months, I followed every rule, didn't even walk to the corner store. But the worst part wasn't the ankle monitor, it was my neighbor Rick. Rick was the type of guy who smiled when things went wrong for you. When my wife left me last year, he watched the moving truck from his window and waved at her. When I lost my job, he asked loudly in front of other neighbors if I could still afford my mortgage. He loved seeing me struggle. And when the monitoring company assigned an officer to check on me every week, guess who walked up my driveway? Rick. My neighbor Rick. I didn't even know he was an officer. If that ankle monitor goes off, his voice trailed off like he was warning me. For 3 months, he showed up 7 times a week to check on me, but found nothing. Then my phone rang at 2:13 a.m. on a Tuesday. Dad? My son's voice was crying. Dad, I fell off the balcony. My arms and legs hurt really bad. Can you come to the hospital, please? My blood froze. The hospital was 12 miles away, and my ankle monitor would start beeping the second I left my quarter-mile radius. But I didn't care, and grabbed my keys anyway. My hands shook as I started the car. I backed out of my driveway, watching my house disappear in the rearview mirror. I made it 4 blocks before the ankle monitor started screaming. Beep, beep, beep. The sound was so loud I could hear it over the engine. A red light started flashing on the device. I had no idea what was going to happen now, but I just kept driving, my foot pressing harder on the gas pedal. I was doing 50 in a 35. My phone started ringing. The monitoring company was calling to ask why I was moving, but I ignored it. Then a new call came and Rick's name lit up my screen. I answered this one. Where are you going? Rick's voice wasn't just angry. He sounded excited. I can see you moving outside your zone. Stop the car. My son is in the hospital, I said, my voice shaking. He broke his arm. I need to consent to his surgery or else they won't perform it. I have to go. You're violating your house arrest. Turn around right now. I can't. My kid needs me. Then you just made the biggest mistake of your life. His voice got quieter, almost satisfied. This is going to be bad for you. Really bad. I hung up without a word. I was doing 60 now, flying through empty streets. The hospital was 6 miles away. Then I saw them in my rearview mirror, blue and red lights, 2 cop cars, then 3. They were far back, but getting closer fast. Their sirens cut through the night. I sped up in response, doing 80 now. The megaphone crackled to life. Pull over immediately! 5 miles to the hospital. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel. I knew if they caught me, I'd be toast, but I couldn't stop. My son was waiting. He was scared and alone and hurting, and I was coming. I pressed harder, going 90 in my 1997 Volvo. Stop the vehicle! This is your final warning. I ran a red light. A car with 2 babies and a mother honked and swerved out of the way. I almost killed them. My car scraped a mailbox on the corner seconds later. The side mirror broke off and fell. I hit the curb and damaged my wheel. Then the megaphone again. They were using threats now. Stop the car, or we will use force. The hospital sign appeared in big blue letters. 2 miles away. My car started making a grinding sound. Smoke started pouring from under the hood. The check engine light came on. I'd been driving my ancient car too fast. The engine was dying, but I kept going. 1 mile to the hospital. I could see it now. I whipped into the parking lot. My tires screaming. Cop cars flooded in right behind me, screaming and clutching their handles. I threw the car in park before it even stopped moving. The door was already opening. I got out and ran. My legs pumped as hard as they could. The hospital entrance was right there, 50 feet away. Medical staff were coming outside, staring at the chaos. Heavy footsteps pounded behind me. Stop! Stop now! 30 feet to the hospital. I could see my son waiting in the ER through the glass doors. Then something hit me from behind like a freight train. I went down hard. My face slammed into the pavement. Don't move! A cop screamed in my ear, knee digging into my neck. I was lying on the ground, handcuffed, 5 feet from the hospital entrance. The nurse was running towards the entrance, and behind her, holding his arm in a white cast, was my son. He saw me, face down on the pavement. 3 cops on top of me, handcuffs. Daddy! He screamed. His face crumpled and he started sobbing, trying to run to me. That's when the cop approached him. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. The cop moved toward my son with slow, careful steps, like he was approaching a scared animal. My son kept screaming for me, his voice cracking and raw, and I tried to lift my head, but the knee pressed harder into my neck. The handcuffs bit into my wrists, metal edges cutting into skin, and I could feel warm blood starting to run down my palm. My son's arm hung in a temporary white splint, the kind they put on fast in emergency rooms, and his good hand reached out toward me across the parking lot distance. His face was red and wet with tears, mouth open in another scream I could barely hear over the ringing in my ears. The pavement scraped against my cheek every time I moved, rough concrete digging into my skin. I could smell motor oil and cigarette butts and my own sweat soaking through my shirt. The cop kept walking toward my son, and I couldn't do anything, couldn't move, couldn't protect him, couldn't even speak with the weight crushing my chest. Then a nurse in blue scrubs appeared between them. She was older, maybe 50, with gray hair pulled back tight, and she stepped right into the cop's path without hesitation. Her hand came up in a stop gesture, palm out, and she said something I couldn't hear. The cop stopped walking. The nurse bent down to my son's level, put her hand on his shoulder, and started guiding him back toward the automatic doors. My son fought against her, twisting to look back at me, his mouth still forming the word "Daddy" over and over. The nurse kept moving him gently but firmly toward the entrance. The automatic doors slid open with that quiet whoosh sound. I watched my son's terrified face disappear behind the glass as the doors closed, his small hand pressed against the window. That image burned into my brain, his palm flat against the glass, his face crumpling. Then rough hands grabbed my arms and hauled me upright. My legs didn't want to work right and I stumbled, the ankle monitor weighing heavy on my leg. They walked me toward a patrol car, one cop on each side gripping my arms tight enough to leave bruises. The red and blue lights kept flashing, painting everything in sick carnival colors. They pushed my head down and shoved me into the back seat, the plastic bench hard and cold through my jeans. The door slammed shut with a heavy metal sound. Through the window, I spotted Rick standing at the edge of all the flashing lights. His arms were crossed over his chest, his monitoring officer uniform neat and clean, like he'd just put it on fresh. He was watching everything unfold with his head tilted slightly to the side. His face showed no concern or sympathy, or even professional interest. Just that same satisfied look he had when my wife's moving truck pulled away last year. That look that said he was enjoying this. He caught my eye through the window and smiled, just a small movement of his mouth, and then turned away. The patrol car started moving, pulling out of the hospital parking lot with the other police cars following behind. The drive to the station took 15 minutes through empty pre-dawn streets. The city looked different at this hour, all the buildings dark, and the streetlights making everything orange and strange. My ankle monitor kept blinking its angry red warning light, the glow reflecting off the plastic divider between me and the front seat. Every bump in the road sent fresh waves of adrenaline through me, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The reality of what I'd done started to sink past the panic. I'd run from the police. I'd driven 90 miles per hour through neighborhoods where people were sleeping. I'd almost hit that minivan with the mother and her babies. The cop in the passenger seat was typing on a laptop mounted to the dashboard, and I could see my name on the screen. At the station, they walked me through a side entrance into a bright hallway that smelled like floor cleaner and coffee. The booking area had fluorescent lights that made everything look too sharp and too real. A woman officer pressed my fingers onto a digital scanner one by one, holding each finger down firmly until the machine beeped. My hands were shaking, so bad she had to grip my wrist to keep it steady. They photographed my face from 3 angles, the camera flash leaving spots in my vision. Then they made me empty my pockets onto a metal table. Wallet, keys, phone, some loose change, a receipt from the gas station. They put everything into a clear plastic property bag and sealed it with tape. Through the plastic, I could see my phone screen lighting up over and over. 17 missed calls from the hospital. The numbers glowed bright in the bag, taunting me. The desk sergeant was a big guy with a gray mustache and tired eyes. He told me they'd check on my son's condition at the hospital, his voice flat and professional like he was reading from a script. I didn't believe him, didn't trust any of them right now. But I was powerless to do anything except nod. Another officer, younger with a buzz cut, motioned for me to follow him. We walked down another hallway toward the holding cells, my ankle monitor beeping quietly with each step. The holding cell was small, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, with concrete walls painted a sick yellow color. A metal bench ran along one wall, and a toilet sat in the corner with no seat or privacy. The door clanged shut behind me, and the lock clicked. I sat down on the bench, the metal cold through my jeans. Alone for the first time since the hospital parking lot, I replayed the moment at the red light over and over in my head. The minivan swerving hard to the right, the horn blaring, the 2 car seats in the back window. I could see it all so clearly now, could imagine what would have happened if I'd been 2 seconds faster through that intersection. The impact, the crash, the car seats crumpling. My stomach lurched and I bent forward, hands on my knees, breathing hard. I almost killed a mother and her babies trying to reach my own child. The knowledge sat in my chest like a stone. What kind of father does that? What kind of person? The minutes crawled by. I counted the cinder blocks in the wall, 32 across, studied the graffiti scratched into the paint, names and dates and crude drawings, listened to voices echoing from other cells, some angry, some crying, some just talking to themselves. My phone was in that property bag, and I couldn't call anyone, couldn't check on my son, couldn't do anything but sit and wait. 2 hours later, the desk sergeant came back. His keys jangled as he unlocked the cell door but didn't open it, just stood in the doorway. He had news from the ER. My son was stable. They'd splinted his arm properly. They were waiting for parental consent to proceed with setting the bone. The relief that flooded through me was so strong my legs went weak. My son was okay. He was stable. But the relief immediately crashed against fresh fear because I couldn't give that consent from a jail cell. I opened my mouth to ask how I could sign the forms, but the sergeant was already walking away, the cell door swinging shut again. The lock clicked. Then Rick's face appeared outside the cell bars. His monitoring officer uniform was perfectly pressed despite the late hour, every crease sharp and perfect. He stood close to the bars, hands clasped behind his back in an official stance. His voice came out quiet, almost gentle. He said I ran, just those 2 words. Then his eyes gleamed with something darker, and he added that they won't forget this, that he'll make sure of it. His smile was thin and cold. He stood there for another moment, just watching me through the bars, then turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. 20 minutes later, a different officer walked past my cell. I jumped up and grabbed the bars, called out to him, asked for phone access, said I needed to call the ER, needed to give consent for my son's treatment. Explain that I'm his father and I have the right to make medical decisions. The officer barely slowed down. He told me to wait for arraignment. Said I'd get my phone call then. Just kept walking, ignoring my protests as his footsteps faded down the corridor. I sank back onto the metal bench, head in my hands, the ankle monitor still blinking red in the corner of my vision. Hours crawled by in that cell. When dawn finally came, pale gray light filtered through the high windows and hit the concrete floor in long rectangles. My head pounded from stress and no sleep. The metal handcuff mark still burned red and raw around my wrist. I sat on that cold bench and let myself think clearly for the first time since my phone rang at 2:13 a.m. The chase, flying through that red light. The minivan with the car seats swerving hard to miss me. My son's face when he saw me pinned to the ground. I'd created a chain of disasters, each one worse than the last, all because I panicked and assumed I had to be there in person. Around 8 in the morning, footsteps echoed down the hallway. A woman in a gray suit stopped outside my cell, a leather folder tucked under one arm. She looked younger than I expected, maybe 35, with dark hair pulled back and an expression that seemed professionally calm without being cold. She introduced herself through the bars as Allegra Mills, my court-appointed public defender. I stood up fast, grateful to finally talk to someone who might help. She pulled out a legal pad and asked me to walk her through what happened. I told her everything, the phone call, the ankle monitor going off, the chase. She wrote it all down, her pen moving quick across the page. Then she started listing the charges I'd probably face: violation of house arrest conditions, fleeing from police, reckless endangerment, possibly more depending on what witnesses said and what the prosecutor wanted to add. Each charge she named felt like another weight dropping onto my chest. I asked if I was going to prison. She said it depended on a lot of factors, how I acted now, what the judge thought, whether anyone got hurt. But she explained something that gave me a thin thread of hope. The court could authorize treatment programs instead of straight jail time, modified house arrest with stricter rules, mandatory counseling, and community service. If I cooperated fully and showed genuine accountability, there might be a path that didn't end with me locked up for years. I nodded at everything she said, memorizing the words cooperate and accountability like they were the only things that mattered now. She outlined what cooperation looked like: taking responsibility, no excuses, following every single rule they gave me, showing up to every court date, completing whatever programs they assigned. I told her I'd do all of it, whatever it took. A guard appeared at the cell door and told Allegra the desk sergeant needed to see her for a minute. She excused herself and walked back down the hallway. I sat back down on the bench, my leg bouncing with nervous energy. 5 minutes later, she came back, and her expression had shifted slightly. The desk sergeant had relayed an update from the ER. My ex-wife Jolene had arrived at the hospital 20 minutes ago. She'd provided consent for our son's surgery. They were taking him in now to set the bone properly. Relief hit me so hard my legs went weak. My son was getting the help he needed, but right behind that relief came burning shame, hot and sick in my stomach, because I hadn't been needed there at all. Jolene could consent. The hospital could proceed without me. I'd endangered people for nothing. I'd almost killed a mother and her babies rushing to a hospital where I wasn't even required. The weight of that mistake pressed down on me until I could barely breathe. Allegra watched my face and seemed to understand what I was feeling, but she didn't say anything, just made a note on her legal pad. At 1 in the afternoon, they transported me to the courthouse for arraignment. I sat in a holding area with 6 other people, all of us in the same boat, waiting to hear what the judge would decide. When they called my name, a bailiff led me into the courtroom. The judge sat behind a tall wooden desk, looking down at paperwork. The prosecutor stood on one side. Allegra stood next to me on the other. The judge read the charges out loud. Violation of house arrest, fleeing from law enforcement, reckless endangerment. He asked how I pleaded. Allegra had told me to say not guilty for now, so I did. Then the prosecutor started talking about bail, saying I was a flight risk because I'd already run once. Allegra argued back, saying I had a son in the hospital and strong ties to the community. The judge listened to both sides, then set bail at $5,000. But he added conditions. No driving privileges at all. Intensified monitoring with daily check-ins instead of weekly. A quarter-mile geofence that now included documented exceptions only, meaning I had to get written approval before going anywhere. I felt the invisible walls closing in tighter than before. They processed my bail and released me 3 hours later. Allegra walked me out to the courthouse steps. The afternoon sun felt too bright after being inside all day. She stopped and turned to face me, her expression serious. She explained something that made my stomach drop all over again. Hospitals routinely accept phone consent from parents for non-life-threatening emergencies. They can also proceed with the other guardian's permission if one parent is unavailable. My panicked assumption that I had to be physically present was wrong, completely wrong. That mistake had cost me everything. I'd violated my house arrest, endangered innocent people, traumatized my son, and added serious criminal charges to my record, all based on a false belief that the hospital couldn't treat him without me standing there in person. Allegra's voice was gentle, but firm when she said I needed to remember this feeling, use it to make better choices going forward. A friend picked me up from the courthouse and drove me home. The new ankle monitor felt heavier than the old one, the alerts set tighter. I walked into my empty house and sat on the couch, staring at nothing. Less than an hour later, I heard footsteps on my front porch. Rick knocked twice and let himself in without waiting for an answer. He wore his monitoring officer uniform, every crease sharp and perfect. He said he was there for a compliance check, his smile thin and official. He asked where I'd been that morning. I said the courthouse for arraignment. He asked if I understood my new conditions. I said yes, sir. He asked if I planned to follow the rules this time. I said yes, sir. He walked through my house, checking windows, looking at my car keys on the counter, making notes on a tablet. I stood in the living room and answered every question with yes, sir or no, sir, documenting every word in my head instead of saying what I really thought. When he finally left, I grabbed a notebook from my desk drawer. I opened it to the first page and started logging everything. The date and time of Rick's visit, his exact questions, the tone of his voice, the way he'd smiled when he asked if I planned to follow the rules this time. If he was going to watch me like a hawk, I'd watch him right back, building a paper trail of every petty power play. An hour later, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. A text from Jolene. I opened it and saw a photo of our son in a hospital bed, his arm wrapped in a bright blue cast, looking small and scared against the white sheets. Her message below the photo read, "He asked if you're mad at him for calling you." I opened the voice message app on my phone and hit record. My fingers shook over the red button. I took a breath and started talking, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage. I told him I was sorry for scaring him, that I broke some rules trying to get to him fast, but that none of what happened was his fault. I said I loved him and that I was working on fixing my mistakes. I didn't promise when I'd see him next, because I had no idea what promises I could actually keep anymore. The message lasted 43 seconds. I played it back once to make sure it sounded okay, then sent it to Jolene's phone so she could play it for him. My hands were still shaking when I set the phone down on the coffee table. The next morning, I woke up to 17 notifications on my phone. Someone had tagged me in a post on the neighborhood Facebook group. I opened it, and my chest went tight. A shaky doorbell camera video showed my Volvo flying past a house at what looked like 100 miles an hour. The timestamp read 2:47 a.m. You could hear my engine screaming and see smoke starting to pour from under the hood. The video had been shared 42 times already. I scrolled down to the comments section and immediately wished I hadn't. People were calling me a danger to society. Someone wrote that I should be locked up for years. Another comment said I didn't deserve to be a parent. A woman posted that she recognized my car and now she was scared to let her kids play outside. I read every single comment, each one making me feel smaller and more ashamed, but I couldn't stop scrolling. There were over 100 responses now. I finally closed the app and threw my phone across the couch. An hour later, my phone rang from where it had landed between the cushions. I dug it out and saw an unknown number. I answered anyway. The voice on the other end belonged to an older man who said he owned the mailbox I'd destroyed during the chase. I cut him off before he could say more and told him I'd pay for all the repairs immediately. I apologized for the damage and the mess I'd caused. He was quiet for a second, then said he wanted to see what the court says first. His tone suggested he was thinking about more than just a broken mailbox, maybe considering a lawsuit for property damage beyond the simple repair cost. I told him again that I'd cover everything and gave him my word. He said he'd be in touch and hung up. I sat there staring at my phone, adding another consequence to the growing list. That evening, my phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed the hospital's main number. I answered, and a woman introduced herself as Millie Costa, one of the ER nurses who'd helped with my son. Her voice was kind, but there was something firm underneath it. She said my son kept asking why I was on the ground with police on top of me. He wanted to know if the officers were hurting me and why I couldn't get up. Millie told me gently that I needed to think carefully about how to explain what happened without making him carry guilt that belonged to adults. Kids his age blame themselves for things, she said, and I had to be really careful with my words. I thanked her and promised I would think about it. After we hung up, I realized I had no idea what the right words even were. How do you explain to a scared kid that you broke the law trying to reach him without making him feel responsible for your choices? 3 days after my arrest, Allegra called with news that made me sit up straighter on the couch. She said she was filing a formal complaint about Rick serving as my monitoring officer when he was also my neighbor. The conflict of interest was obvious, she explained, and she thought we could use it to get him reassigned from my case. It might also help my credibility with the judge when we went back to court. She sounded confident about the complaint, like this was the kind of thing that could actually make a difference. I asked her what would happen next, and she said the monitoring company would have to investigate. Rick would probably get pulled from my case during the review. For the first time since the arrest, I felt something that wasn't just shame or fear. It was small, but it was there. The next day, Allegra sent me an email with a document attached. The subject line read, "Review before filing." I opened the attachment and read through the formal complaint she'd written. It laid out every interaction I'd documented with Rick, every comment he'd made, the way he'd shown up at my house more often than required. The document made it all look official and serious, instead of just me complaining about a neighbor I didn't like. At the bottom, Allegra had added a note asking me to keep all future interactions with Rick strictly professional and documented. Don't give him any ammunition, she wrote. I printed the complaint and read it 3 more times. Someone official finally saw what I'd been dealing with for 3 months. The vindication felt real and solid, even though I knew it didn't erase what I'd done that night. That same night, I opened my laptop and searched for AA meetings in my area. I found one starting in 20 minutes that met over video call. I clicked the link and joined, turning off my camera so nobody could see me. My living room felt too quiet as faces appeared on the screen, people sitting in their own homes just like me. The meeting started and people began sharing their stories. I didn't say a word, just listened. A guy around my age talked about the night he drove drunk with his daughter in the back seat and got pulled over. A woman described losing her job because she kept showing up hungover. Another man shared about the moment his wife left and took their kids. Every single story hit me somewhere deep. I recognized myself in their words, in the choices they'd made, in the moment when drinking caught up with them and everything fell apart. The meeting lasted an hour, and I stayed silent the whole time, but something shifted inside me, just from listening. 2 days later, Jolene called. Her voice was careful and measured when she said she had a proposal. If I stuck to my treatment plan and followed every single rule without any exceptions, she'd agree to supervised visits with our son. The visits would start short and gradually get longer if I proved I could handle the responsibility. Her tone made it really clear this wasn't a gift or a favor. This was a test. One more mistake, and I'd lose access to him completely. I told her I understood and that I'd do whatever it took. She said the first visit could happen in 2 weeks if I stayed compliant. After we hung up, I sat very still, feeling the weight of what she'd just offered and what it would cost me if I messed it up. 5 days after my arrest, my phone rang with another unfamiliar number. I answered, and a man introduced himself as Russell Kane from the monitoring company's main office. His voice was neutral and professional, giving nothing away about whether he was on my side or Rick's. He said he needed to schedule an interview with me about the complaint Allegra had filed. Could I come to the county office tomorrow afternoon? I said yes immediately and wrote down the address and time. Russell thanked me and ended the call. I had no idea what to expect from the interview or what Russell thought about the whole situation. All I could do was show up and tell the truth. The next afternoon, I walked into the county office building, my ankle monitor beeping softly as I passed through the security checkpoint. Russell met me in a small conference room on the 3rd floor. He was maybe 50, with gray hair and reading glasses hanging from a chain around his neck. He shook my hand and gestured for me to sit down across from him at a plain table. Russell pulled out a tablet and opened a file, then looked up at me. He started by outlining the company policy against dual relationships, where officers monitor people they have personal connections with. The policy existed specifically to avoid conflicts of interest and maintain professional boundaries. Russell paused and said directly that they had slipped on this one, assigning Rick to my case when he lived next door. Then he asked me to share my perspective on Rick's conduct over the past 3 months. I pulled out my notebook with all the documented interactions and walked Russell through everything, keeping my voice steady and factual. Russell took notes on his tablet, occasionally asking follow-up questions, his expression staying carefully neutral the entire time. Notebook from my pocket laid flat on the table between us, every page filled with dates and exact words. Russell flipped through slowly, stopping on certain entries to read them twice. After 20 minutes, he closed the notebook and slid it back across the table, thanking me for my cooperation and saying he'd be in touch within 2 weeks. I walked out of that building feeling lighter than I had in days, knowing someone official was finally paying attention to what had been happening. The next afternoon, I drove to the address the mailbox owner had given me over the phone, a small house 3 blocks from where I'd scraped his property during the chase. A man in his 60s answered the door, his face cautious but not hostile. I handed him the cashier's check for $240 to cover the replacement cost plus installation, along with a handwritten note on plain paper. The note said I was sorry for damaging his property and that there was no excuse for my reckless driving that night. He read it standing in his doorway, then folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. He shook my hand with a firm grip and told me he hoped I got the help I needed. His tone wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either, just matter of fact. We both nodded, and I walked back to my car, that small piece of accountability checked off my growing list. My second supervised visit with my son happened 3 days later in the same hospital family room. The social worker sat in her usual corner with her clipboard, while we unpacked the Lego ambulance kit I'd brought. My son grabbed the instruction booklet immediately and started sorting pieces by color, his cast-free arm moving easily now. We worked together building the vehicle piece by piece, him reading the steps out loud while I snapped the bricks into place. Halfway through, he pointed at my ankle monitor sitting visible above my shoe and said it looked like a robot bracelet. His voice was light when he said it, almost joking, and I laughed because the comparison was actually pretty accurate. The social worker smiled from her corner and made a note on her clipboard. That lightness in his voice felt like forgiveness I hadn't earned yet, but desperately wanted to keep hearing. We finished the ambulance and rolled it across the table, making siren sounds, and for those 2 hours, things felt almost normal. 13 days after my arrest, Allegra called with news about the plea deal. The prosecutor's office was offering extended house arrest for another 6 months, 80 hours of community service, mandatory completion of treatment programs, full payment for all damages, and no jail time if I stayed compliant with every single rule. She walked through each condition slowly, making sure I understood what I was agreeing to. The deal was harsh, but it was fair considering what I'd done. I told her I'd take it without hesitation. She said she'd communicate my acceptance to the prosecutor and that we should hear back within 48 hours about next steps. The prosecutor called Allegra back the next day with a counter. They wanted 10 days in county jail added to the deal to send a message about fleeing from police. Allegra explained this to me over the phone, her voice calm and measured. She said judges have room to decide and that my cooperation, plus the whole Rick situation, might work in my favor, but she wanted me prepared for either outcome. I told her I understood and that whatever the judge decided, I'd accept it and move forward. She said that was exactly the right attitude to have going into court. The parenting class intake session happened on a Thursday evening at a community center downtown. I walked into a room with 6 folding chairs arranged in a circle, 5 other men already sitting and waiting. The facilitator introduced herself and asked us each to share briefly what brought us there. One man talked about losing his temper and scaring his kids. Another shared about the moment his wife left and took their children. A third described how his drinking had cost him custody. Every single story hit me somewhere deep because I recognized myself in their words, in the choices they'd made, in the moment when everything fell apart. The facilitator thanked everyone for their honesty and explained that the program would run 8 weeks with weekly meetings. I stayed silent during that first session, but something shifted inside me just from listening, realizing I wasn't uniquely terrible or alone in this struggle. 15 days after my arrest, a formal letter arrived from the monitoring company with Russell's name in the signature block. The letter stated that their review had confirmed a policy violation, that Rick had shown poor judgment in accepting my case given our neighbor relationship, and that he was being permanently reassigned away from my monitoring district. The language was carefully worded to avoid admitting any real liability, full of phrases like procedural oversight and corrective action. But the bottom line was clear. Rick wouldn't be showing up at my door anymore. I read the letter 3 times, then filed it in the folder with all my other legal documents. Allegra called that same evening after I'd texted her about the letter. Her first words were a reminder not to celebrate or gloat about Rick's reassignment. She said it helped my credibility and showed the system could work, but it didn't change the facts of what I did that night. The high-speed chase, the near collision, the danger I created for innocent people. Those things still happened regardless of Rick's conflict of interest. Her pragmatism kept me grounded when I wanted to feel vindicated, reminding me that accountability meant owning all of it, not just the parts that weren't my fault. The night before my court hearing, I sat at my kitchen table with 2 blank pieces of paper in front of me. On the first page, I wrote a statement to my son explaining why I made the choices I did that night and what I was learning from the consequences. I kept it simple and honest, talking about panic and fear and how those feelings made me forget about everyone else's safety. On the second page, I wrote a statement for the court, taking full responsibility for the danger I created. I didn't make excuses about Rick or the emergency or my desperation. I just laid out what I did and acknowledged that it was wrong. Writing both statements out helped me face the hearing with clarity instead of defensiveness, knowing exactly what I needed to say. Court started at 9 the next morning. Judge Gerald Tate sat behind the bench looking over paperwork while the bailiff called my case number. I stood next to Allegra at the defense table, my hands folded in front of me. Judge Tate looked up and asked me directly why I ran from police instead of pulling over to explain the emergency. The courtroom went quiet. I answered plainly that I was panicking and only thinking about my son, not about the law or the other people I was putting in danger. My voice stayed steady as I said it, meeting his eyes, not trying to justify what I'd done. Allegra stepped forward and presented documentation to the judge. She laid out my AA attendance records showing 6 meetings over 2 weeks, the restitution payment receipt for the mailbox, my enrollment confirmation for the parenting class, the monitoring company's letter about the conflict of interest finding. She let the paperwork demonstrate my efforts without making dramatic arguments or asking for sympathy. Judge Tate reviewed each document carefully, making notes on his copy of the case file. The prosecutor stood and walked to a screen at the front of the courtroom, pressing a button that made traffic camera footage appear. The timestamp showed 2:47 a.m., the intersection lit by streetlights, and then my Volvo came flying through the frame doing at least 80. The minivan entered from the right side, a mom driving with 2 car seats visible in the back, and my car missed her front bumper by maybe 3 feet. She swerved hard, her brake lights flashing, her vehicle rocking as she fought to stay on the road. The prosecutor let the footage play twice more, the near miss looking worse each time I watched it. I kept my eyes on the screen and didn't look away or make excuses, just sat there accepting what I'd done and how close I came to killing 3 innocent people who had nothing to do with my emergency. Judge Tate leaned forward and asked if I understood how serious this was, and I said, "Yes, sir, I understood completely." The prosecutor sat down, and Judge Tate picked up his pen, writing something on the paperwork in front of him before looking up at me with an expression that was stern but not angry. He read the sentence out loud in a clear voice that carried through the quiet courtroom. 7 days in county jail starting immediately. 120 additional days of house arrest with extended monitoring beyond my original sentence. 80 hours of community service to be completed within 6 months. Mandatory completion of all court-ordered treatment programs, including substance abuse counseling and parenting classes. Full payment for all property damage, including the mailbox, my vehicle towing and impound fees and court costs. Suspension of my driving privileges for 1 full year with no exceptions. The jail time hit me hard in the chest, but I felt relief wash over me too, because it could have been so much worse, could have been years instead of days. I stood up when the bailiff motioned to me and turned to look at Allegra in the gallery behind the defense table. She gave me a small nod and mouthed the words, "I'll call Jolene," so I knew my ex-wife would get the timeline for when I'd be out. The bailiff put his hand on my elbow and guided me toward a side door, and I focused on the fact that 7 days was temporary, that I could get through this and come back better than before. The county jail processed me in through the same routine as before, fingerprints and photos and property bag, except this time they led me past the holding cells to a pod with rows of metal bunks. A guard assigned me to the top bunk in the far corner and handed me a thin mattress, 1 sheet, and a scratchy blanket that smelled like industrial detergent. Mealtimes happened at 6 in the morning, noon, and 5 in the evening. The food served on plastic trays that we ate at metal tables bolted to the floor. The days blurred together into a routine of wake-up calls, meals, a few hours in a common area with a TV that only got 3 channels, and long stretches of time lying on my bunk staring at the ceiling. I spent a lot of time thinking about everything that led me here, playing back the choices I made and seeing clearly where I went wrong. On day 3, I asked a guard for paper and a pen, and I wrote a letter to my son that took me 2 hours to get right. I told him I was sorry for scaring him and that I was learning about patience and making safe choices even when things feel urgent. I explained that rules exist to protect everyone, not just to make life hard, and that breaking them always causes problems even when the reasons feel important. I promised to be more careful and think about other people's safety, not just my own fears and emergencies. Writing it all out helped me see the situation more clearly, helped me understand what I needed to say when I saw him again. On release day, they called my name at 6 in the morning and led me back to processing where my property bag waited on the counter. A technician from the monitoring company showed up 30 minutes later with a new ankle monitor in a hard plastic case. He cut off my old monitor with a special tool and fitted the new one around my ankle, the band tighter and the device itself bigger than before. He explained the new rules carefully, pointing to a small screen on the device that would show my location radius in real time. Any violation would trigger an immediate alert to the monitoring company, the police, and my probation officer all at once. The geofence was smaller now, just 3 blocks in any direction from my house, and I had to get written permission 48 hours in advance for any approved exceptions. I signed every form he put in front of me without reading them closely, just grateful to be going home instead of staying another day. A taxi picked me up outside the jail entrance and drove me back to my house, the morning sun bright and the streets full of people heading to work like it was just a normal day. My first supervised visit happened 2 days later in my living room, the social worker sitting in the chair by the window with a clipboard on her lap. My son walked in looking nervous, his eyes going straight to the new ankle monitor before he sat down on the couch across from me. He asked if I was going to run away again, his voice small and testing. I answered honestly that I wasn't, that I learned my lesson about following the rules no matter what. He pointed at the monitor and asked if it was stronger than the old one, if it would stop me better this time. I stayed patient and calm, explaining that the new one had tighter tracking, but that the real difference was me understanding why the rules mattered. The social worker took notes while we talked, and after a few minutes my son relaxed enough to tell me about school and his friends and how his arm didn't hurt anymore. We played a card game for the rest of the hour, and when the visit ended, he hugged me quickly before leaving with the social worker. 3 days after that visit, Jolene and I sat down with the social worker at a county office to work out a formal schedule. The social worker spread papers across the table, showing a plan tied directly to my program compliance. As long as I attended my AA meetings, completed my community service hours on time, and followed every single monitoring rule, my visits would increase from 1 hour to 2 hours, then to 4 hours, and eventually to unsupervised time. If I missed any requirements or violated any conditions, the visits would go back to supervised or stop completely until I got back on track. Jolene listened to the whole plan and then looked at me and said this was fair, that she'd support it as long as I held up my end. The social worker had us both sign the agreement, and we left the office without talking beyond what was necessary to confirm the schedule. 5 weeks after my arrest, I sat in my regular AA meeting on a Wednesday night and listened to the speaker talk about small victories mattering more than big promises. When the meeting ended, the group leader called my name and handed me a small bronze coin with 30 days stamped on one side. I took it without making a speech or drawing attention, just slipped it into my pocket where I could feel the weight of it against my leg. The coin reminded me that progress happened in small steps, that 30 days was something real, even if it didn't fix everything I'd broken. The next afternoon, my phone rang, and Millie's name appeared on the screen. She told me my son's cast was coming off next week, that the bone had healed well, and he was excited to have his arm back. She said he'd been sleeping better lately, too. No more nightmares about the police lights and sirens. Her words brought relief, mixed with the memory of how he looked on that pavement outside the ER, and I used that feeling to stay focused on my compliance and my programs. I thanked her for the update and for taking care of him, and she said she hoped things kept getting better for our family. 2 days later, a formal notice arrived in my mailbox on official monitoring company letterhead. The letter confirmed that Rick had been permanently reassigned to a different monitoring district and that no further contact between us was permitted per company policy. The language was careful and legal, avoiding any admission of wrongdoing, but making the outcome clear. I read the letter twice, then filed it in my folder with all my other legal documents, without feeling happy or triumphant about it. Just grateful the situation was finally resolved, and I could move forward without that extra tension. The next week, I started my community service hours at a rehabilitation center's thrift shop on the east side of town. My new monitoring officer drove me there the first morning and explained the rules about staying in the building and checking in every 2 hours. Inside, the manager showed me to the back room where donations piled up in cardboard boxes and plastic bags. My job was sorting clothes, testing electronics, and stacking furniture that people could actually use. I pulled baby cribs from the donation pile 3 times that first day, each one making my stomach twist as I thought about the minivan with those 2 babies inside. The mother's horn blast echoed in my head while I checked the crib slats for safety and wiped down the rails. Every piece of baby furniture felt like a reminder of what I almost destroyed, and I used that feeling to work harder, moving faster, turning the guilt into something useful. The physical work made my back ache and my hands dirty, but it felt right, like actual penance, instead of just sitting around thinking about my mistakes. 2 weeks after starting community service, the social worker approved my first supervised visit in my own living room, instead of the hospital family room. She arrived at 3 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon, set her bag in the corner chair, and pulled out a notebook, while my son walked in behind her. He looked around the room like he was seeing it for the first time, even though he'd lived here before the divorce. The ankle monitor sat on the coffee table where I'd placed it before they arrived, the black plastic box with its blinking green light just part of the furniture now. We played a board game about building roads and cities, and he beat me twice without the social worker saying much beyond writing her notes. The monitor never beeped, never flashed red, just sat there between us while we rolled dice and moved pieces around the board. When the hour ended, my son hugged me quickly at the door, and the social worker nodded like she'd seen what she needed to see. The following week, Jolene called to discuss the visit schedule, and her voice sounded different from it had in months. She told me the social worker's report was positive, and that if I kept up perfect compliance for another month, she'd agree to extend the visits to 4 hours instead of 1. Her tone had shifted from suspicious to something closer to cautious hope, like she wanted to believe I could actually follow through this time. I thanked her without making promises or trying to negotiate for more, just accepted what she offered and told her I'd keep doing exactly what the program required. Trust was being rebuilt in tiny pieces, and I was learning to accept the slow pace instead of pushing for faster progress. 8 weeks after that terrible night outside the hospital, I finished building a small birdhouse with my son during our last 4-hour visit. We painted it blue and yellow, his favorite colors, and I took a photo of it sitting on my kitchen counter after he left. I texted him the picture that evening with a simple message asking if he liked how it turned out. His reply came back 10 minutes later, showing his arm held up in the photo, no cast anymore, just his hand giving a thumbs up with a big smile on his face. The exchange was simple and good, just a dad and his kid sharing something they made together, and I felt genuinely grateful, not for how things turned out, but for the chance to keep earning back what I almost destroyed.